Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are we doing this morning?
Doing well, thank you. We're going to stamp out the injustices in this country.
Let's stamp.
And Biden's on our side.
Yeah.
He says, well, there is a lot of injustice going on, domestic things. So he's starting a new organization, a new bureaucracy, a new department to address the subject of domestic terrorism.
Yes.
And there are terrorists all over the place.
Yeah.
And they have to identify them, because the ones who really commit the real terrorism, they have to have special treatment so the police leave them alone. So, oh, we don't really arrest you in this administration if we think you've really done something wrong. Anyway, this whole idea of accelerating at the federal level the problem of domestic terrorism, because there's a lot of violence in the country. But you know, the country was set up in a way where breaking the law, which is mostly what they're talking about, they're pretending they're talking about insurrection so that they can, I guess, justify more federal involvement. But what they're doing is they're trying to justify this by arguing the case that there's so much terrorism going on. But you know, from the very beginning, when this whole term came about, was when we had the great debate after 9/11 and the Patriot Act came up, and we had to get the terrorists who came. Of course, I remember us working on let's try to get people to define terrorism, because if it's carelessly done, it just opens up the door, and nobody knows what's going on. Besides, terrorism was considered a tactic. It wasn't considered a crime, or it wasn't considered a group of people, and they weren't. You can't name a country and say this country's terrorist and address it. But there's no authority in the Constitution for dealing with domestic law breaking, and we know that is not even though they're abusing those rules, they didn't seem to care a whole lot when there was a lot of violence in the cities last summer.
Yeah.
You know, that looked terroristic in the sense that a lot of problems were out there. But the justification from this, I would say, is the propaganda of the last year. And it's incessant. I mentioned to you, I didn't think they did play some of that violence in the inner city, and they were always in the liberal cities. But compared to the amount that we saw and the number of crimes that were being committed and buildings torn down and all the carnage that was going on, compared to the coverage of some views from January 6th, January 6th is the propaganda tool, and it's to move along, because I think Democrats are feeling under the gun. They're on the defensive now, and they need some distraction. So they've had the war on COVID. That's been a distraction, but it's also created more crimes, and many crimes committed by our own government by undermining our liberties. But once again, they see a problem, and they have to have more rules, more laws, more money, and a more department. So the Justice Department, which isn't doing so well in the eyes of the American people. You know, our Justice Department, our CIA, our FBI have been under the guns for 50, 60 years. And I imagine even Truman recognized from the very beginning, if I knew what they were going to do, I'd have never signed that bill. He says he thought it was for collecting surveillance information to protect our country, but it turned out to be something that was, very misleading to it. In the same way with J. Edgar Hoover, just think of how we started out with that. So the American people, though, maybe they're starting to lose confidence. But I predict that this is dealing with only enhancing the power of the state for political reasons. Who's going to have the power? And maybe if we can find out, they wouldn't dare accuse a Trump supporter of committing terrorists, would they? And so we have to be concerned about this. But this is not going to solve their problem. Matter of fact, what they're doing is the problem. They're breaking the law by doing this, breaking the constitutional law, and it's being misused, I think, as a political tool. And I can't see where there's any sincere effort on the part of the people who are supporting this, that we're doing this for peace and prosperity for this country.
Yeah, you said they need a distraction. I would say they need an enemy. They need to create enemies, and they need to get rid of their political opponents. And I think this is what it's all about. This is a solution in search of a problem, because you walk around town, you walk around the country, you look around, is domestic terrorism, are people blowing things up? Are white supremacists blowing things up and lynching people? No, it's not happening. People are getting hurt in the inner cities, as you talk about, record numbers of shootings. That doesn't matter. You got to take this on. And terrorism, like you say, what about this? What about the black business owners in these places that were burned down, watching their life's work being burned down by liberal white Antifa supporters? But let's look at some clips, because this is what we're talking about. It's been out for a couple of days now. Here's the first one from Business Insider. Biden's Justice Department is creating a new domestic terrorism unit, but experts are skeptical about whether it'll make Americans safer. And I kind of like that second part of the title, Dr. Paul, so I went and I looked at the article, and it wasn't because they think it's really goofy and this is kind of a red herring thing. It's because it's not going to get enough money. It's not going to have enough power. That was their complaint. But so you ask, well, what is domestic terrorism? Because it really hasn't been defined very well. It's already illegal to blow stuff up. It's already illegal to burn people up and shoot them and all this and that. So what is it? Well, here's the deputy deputy. Let's put up the next clip. He is the Justice Department, I think, deputy director. Yeah, Assistant Attorney General, for National Security, Matthew Olson. And he said, we have seen a growing threat from those who are motivated by racial animus, as well as those who ascribe to extremist, anti-government, and anti-authority ideologies, is what he told the Senate Judiciary Committee. Dr. Paul, now be honest with me. Do you have an anti-authority ideology?
There you go.
Because I'm getting worried.
Oh, I know. We might be on a list somewhere. But it's such a farce when you think about it, because they paint it as doing something very good and necessary to make things more peaceful, and they're not they're not that much interested in the way the country's set up, federalism, and whether this is a federal problem or not. But the one thing that bothers me about this January 6th thing is that is used as the reason for this terrorist unit to be set up. But guess what? The people, the so-called insurrection, I wonder where their headquarters for that insurrection was. Don't they have a center point? And they'd probably create one. But they didn't even carry guns in there.
No.
If it's a real insurrection with a mob of people coming in to take over the government, and they didn't have a gun except some unfriendly policeman, maybe. I don't know who he was or what he was, because they weren't allowed to investigate who did the only killing.
Yeah.
And most people call it a murder.
Yeah,
because it's seen under, there's a video of it. So there, that I don't consider to fit the so-called term of terrorism, because quite frankly, I think that's a made-up term to be used for anything they want. But they chose not the only vicious, violent murder that occurred there. What did they do? They know the policeman who did it.
Yeah.
It happened to be a Capitol Hill policeman.
Yep.
But they had investigations for 4 months and get all this information, accumulated a lot of films which the Republicans aren't allowed to see.
Yeah.
At the same time, the policeman that committed this crime, they didn't even talk to him.
Yeah, no.
And this is the group of people who are going to stop the terrorism, and they are not going to confess up and say, well, yeah, this is really all politics, and this is the way politics work in this country. This is how you win elections. This is what we have to do because we're under the gun, and we have to stop, the Trump people from ever winning an election again, or even if you're a supporter. Matter of fact, it may come to the point that even if you're just a Trump supporter, that you may be charged under what they're talking about.
Certainly under suspicion, that's for sure. Well, they need to have this January 6th as an insurrection, which it is not. And I did an update for our subscribers, and I'll talk about that later. Or I quote Matt Taibbi, who talks about, hey, any of us who have ever been in a place where these things do happen immediately recognize this was not an insurrection. And Taibbi is I would say, a progressive libertarian. He's not a Trump supporter by any stretch. It wasn't, and not only that, but as our friend Julie Kelly has written, and she has a new book out, by the way, on January 6th. I haven't read it, but I'm sure it's great because she's great. Who were all these people with color-coded orange ski hats and things in their ear that were, pretending to be Proud Boys and this? Who were these people? We don't know. They're not investigating them. Why can't we see the 14,000 hours of surveillance? Congress owns that. Congress could release that. Congress won't. But they need to have this as kind of a storming of the Winter Palace kind of thing, this kind of Bastille Day thing, so that they can use it to go after their enemies. And you talk about farce, I would almost go on to say buffoonery, because look at this next. Here's a quote from our president about this whole need to go after domestic terrorism. It's this typical Biden ridiculous speak. I did not seek this fight brought to the Capitol 1 year ago today, but I will not shrink from it either. I will stand in this breach. I will defend this nation, and I will allow no one to place a dagger at the throat of our democracy. And can I have another ice cream cone? No, he didn't say that. But he may as well.
And what will the sacrifice be?
Yeah.
The people of this country can't even walk through the Capitol. There's going to be restraints from access to their members of Congress. It is such a farce. But, we have to keep looking. And some days it's tougher finding the people who will be energized to say, this is getting bad. I better pay more attention about it. We need to do more resistance. And maybe we'll just take our mask off today for just to take a rebellious type of position.
Exactly. Well, here before we move on, though, this is the Ron Paul philosophy that people are waking up, and there is a good news buried in this bad news, and that's in this next clip. This is a couple of days ago. Daily Caller ran this, but you see it everywhere. Nearly 50% of Americans think the FBI is Biden's personal Gestapo. That's a new poll that was done a couple of weeks ago. So on the one hand, you have the FBI creating this domestic terror unit, and then you've got half the country thinking it's a Gestapo. That's a pretty serious thing, and it's also encouraging that they're starting to look at it this way.
But it's also a little bit sad that it's taken so long, because the history of both the CIA and the FBI, the early people in both the CIA, Truman, it didn't take him long to say, if I'd have known what they were going to do, I'd have never signed the CIA bill. I don't know whether he was saying that for grandstanding or not, but I happen to believe that he probably didn't know, and he signed it, and it was after World War II, so that's why that got started. But also the FBI has been known to be very, very corrupt. I believe the stories and the report of how the FBI was associated with some of the activities when Martin Luther King was killed. And we certainly know pretty well, there's a tremendous amount of evidence and talk about how Jack Kennedy was killed in the CIA. I believe that more the case than Castro or the Russians, coming in. But anyway, so there's a long history. So this is good. This may be the breaking point where people have to start questioning the law enforcement agencies, because I can't remember, I think it took me a long time to even consider the fact that some people like in the FBI would be not trustworthy, because I met a lot of people in the FBI, not the CIA, but the FBI, and I consider them my good neighbors and all. Sure. So, but it's the leadership that counts, but this is shifting. And and I was always taught as growing up that one of the worst things you can have are crooked police. And I think this is what we're talking about. The Justice Department has just been atrocious, on how they make, if you're indicted right now, an indictment, that whole system has to be changed. An indictment, I think it's like 98% of the time, if you're indicted, you're found guilty. It's very hard to get off if you've been indicted once they get around to checking things out and going through to the grand jury.
Especially if you're poor, right?
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is this big push for voting reform and election reform and ending the filibuster and all of this business. And it's a big deal, and there's a lot to go over. We're going to touch on a few reflections you have on it.
Yes, reforms. We have tried to condition people, be wary, be aware of whatever they're doing if they say there's going to be reforms, because it's usually deforming what they're going to do. So this is a big deal. It's ongoing right now, you know, and Schumer has it all lined up because he's playing on this whole thing. There's more racism than ever before, and he has to make sure that the critical race theory continues their lifetime and influencing people. And so therefore they have to, it's the elections that are the problem.
Yeah.
And we have to have fair election. But I think they have other goals in place. Ultimate goal is getting rid of the Electoral College, and for now it is to make sure that we have a mobocracy rather than a republic. They never talk about the republic, they talk about democracy.
Yeah.
And democracy, pure democracy, is the dictatorship of the majority. And these are the people who are always arguing the case for the minority.
Yeah.
And what they're wanting to do is destroy the rights of the minority. So if you're in a state where you're in a minority, and let's say it happens to be a state and it's a minority and they happen to be non-white.
Yeah.
That's their only protection they have, is to have representation. So if they end up getting, and they've talked about it for years, but this is a big move on. But I believe they want to get rid of the Electoral College, and they want to make sure that senators are elected in a different manner. Most of the time they run into problems because these suggestions have been around for a long time, but there's also a stronger sentiment right now, and they're racing to get this done because they know next year it's not going to get any easier for them.
Yeah, and they've got nothing else to run on, so they got to risk the elections, right? Well, you know, Molly Hemingway, who writes for The Federalist, with whom I was a journalism fellow many, many years ago, really good writer, very astute. She has a great piece out, and she talks about, I know this is going to shock you, Dr. Paul, cowardly Republicans in the Senate who are just letting this thing fly by because they're terrified. They're not putting up a fight over this reform because they're terrified of challenging the Democrat narrative that the vote in 2020 was absolutely pristine. It was the best vote we've ever had. And Hemingway quotes Time magazine, hardly a bastion of extremist conspiracy rhetoric. Time magazine itself, in an article not long ago, talked about the election as what happened in the election as a well-funded cabal of powerful people, quote, ranging across industries and ideologies, working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information. This is from Time magazine about the election. It was a revolution in how people vote. We know that Mark Zuckerberg spent, $400 and some million to affect the vote. Or you didn't have to show up. You could vote by mail. You could just, however many you want to, just keep voting, change all the rules. But Republicans are too cowardly. And they basically, there's a straw man that if you say there are some problems in the elections and they're not because people aren't being allowed to vote, there's something else. If there's a straw man that if you say that, somehow you're a January 6er, right? And that's what, most Republicans are just terrified. McConnell and the others are just terrified. They don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But you know who's not terrified? Like you said, Schumer, Pelosi, these guys are not terrified at all. They smell blood in the water.
That's right. And in combination with the Voting Rights Act is the filibuster, because the Republicans are using the filibuster right now to try to prevent some of this from happening. So they have to have a vote to maybe today, tomorrow, or soon, as long as this is in the news, to get rid of the filibuster. Once again, attack the minority and let the mob, the collectivism of the majority dictate. That's why we have a constitution, was actually to prevent that. The founders really didn't like democracy.
They were
because
smart.
they thought it would be it would turn into what we have right now. But this whole thing about on the election, here the atrocious thing that just happened in New York City has to have done some good, because maybe a few people woke up because the mayor said, "Oh, okay, we need more political clout. We're going to allow 800,000 non-citizens vote in the city election." Well, then the state election and the federal election, the principle is there. Just just waving the pen. But how many illegals vote now?
Yeah.
I'm convinced there are a few that do this. So that's what they're arguing. But in 1976, I was very naive and very innocent, and probably had no understanding that I might win the election. And I ended up winning an election where I won by 100 votes or so. And so there was a contest going on, and the results were that these 100 votes were canceled out rather easily, and we had a contest. So we looked at all the people that voted. We found that 1,300 people voted from vacant lots. They didn't exist. So that covered their 100 votes they needed. So all this stuff of voter ID, and now voter ID would have, if we had it, it wasn't even efficient. We needed more voter ID.
Yeah.
That would have been canceled. But now, what they're talking about, how do you cancel out honest, decent, registered voters from voting?
Yeah.
You know, so if you have one non-citizen vote and could have a criminal record.
Yeah.
Sometimes that happens too.
No.
They have one person vote and they cancel out the other one.
Another
So
citizen.
all they needed to cancel out the 100 votes that I had, you know, it would be 100 people to do it. So this is all about canceling voting rights.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with preserving voting rights. But there's one thing, and we talked about a lot in Congress, is look at the title and tell me what the title is, and start with the idea that it's probably opposite of what the title says. And that goes for this stuff too. This is protection of voting rights.
Yeah.
So maybe it's exactly the opposite, and usually that is the case.
And they've never brought forth a single person who was completely qualified to vote but was turned away from the polling station. You think if that person existed, that person would be up there next to Biden. I tried to vote and I had my... And it's funny, especially in somewhere like New York City, it's racist to ask people to produce an ID to vote, but it's not racist to demand they have a vaccine passport to go to a restaurant. And of course, even though we know that the blacks in New York City are the least vaccinated group, that's not racist to kick them out of there. But you know, the one thing about the Republicans, Dr. Paul, and Molly put it in her piece, 69% of Republicans, this is according to a Washington Post poll this month, 69% of Republicans are seriously concerned about the 2020 elections and election integrity. So if the Republicans think they're going to just go ahead and skate right through and take over the Senate and House, they had better address some of the concerns with a very restless electorate who is tired of people just saying, hey, let's drop it, you know, let's move on.
Yeah, so I do want to move on. If you have another statement there,
No,
I'll move on to something a little bit less, well, what should I say, less serious. Well, it's serious, but not quite like changing, getting rid of the Electoral College and all that's reform done underlying. But to protect an empire, the only way you can protect it is with lies. I want to talk briefly about something going on with these masks. The mask, you know, they've talked about the junkie mask, and they've been around, and there's billions of them, and they've been an economic disaster. They have not saved anybody's life, and most people know that. Then there's a better mask called the N95 mask, and now they're talking, the progressives say, well, if we just tighten up and have a mandate, make everybody get those. You can't, and you will be maybe put in the terrorist camp if you won't put on a good mask because you're trying to kill people. So they want to do this. But even above this, there's a story now that they have just developed a super good mask, and they'll be moving it. Instead, they're discovering now there's more admission that these masks really haven't worked.
Yeah.
There's no medical evidence that they have prevented it on the states that didn't use masks, but they still are emphasizing it's just they have to do something, but they always did this to impress their constituents. Oh, this is what I did. I'm doing this and this, and I always wear my mask unless I'm at dinner or unless I want to go out to a party.
Yeah.
You know, so the people have lost confidence in all of that, and that is good. But now I think the job of the people who understand this a little bit better, the whole system of COVID, should get it out there, people, and they should not only not accept blindly this whole thing about the N95, but to question the other use. The N95 actually is a better mask, and it is one that we tried to use, and basically used in the hospitals. But those are conditions quite a bit different when you have open surgery and all. It's just so different to me. It really was narrowed down to a medical decision rather than a political decision.
Yeah. Well, the masks, as we know now, did very little for the virus, but they did a lot for pollution. They clogged up the ocean, they clogged up the whales, they clogged up the seals. It's just a disaster, billions of these things. But if they got rich off them. Let's put up this quote, because this is the article we're talking about, this next clip. This is from Common Dreams, I think. Senator Sanders reintroduces the N95 Mask for All legislation. He called it an absolute scandal that the richest country in the history of the world, high-quality masks are not more readily available to frontline workers, healthcare workers, and all Americans. Well, if we're so rich, why can't we buy them? Well, Laura Ingraham has a good tweet, and there's the next one here if we can put that up. She makes a very good point. He wants to send everyone a single mask, but Laura points out N95s are single use. And the FDA's own website said they're not appropriate for children. So he's going to send you one mask. He's going to send you that one fish, right? One mask. You're going to use it. And what is he going to keep using it? Are you going to send you one every day? The government's going to, we're going to have to shut down everything. No more toilet paper, no more meat, no more anything. We're just going to go into mask making.
They're going to send it to the dry cleaner.
Yeah. I just say, look into who's giving the donations to these senators. Probably a mask company.
Boy. It's almost like, are we in the middle of a bad dream?
Yeah,
Have
really.
we thought? Sometimes it pops in my mind. I don't think this can be true. Maybe I'm reading from The Onion or something. That some of it is so silly, but I found this really interesting.
This is the last story is really interesting.
We haven't heard a whole lot from the Danish people on COVID.
Yeah.
But they finally took the position of being part of the establishment. They didn't fight them. They didn't preach, but they were good world citizens.
Yeah.
They went along with this. And if America said, well, you can't leave anybody, you can't allow anybody leaving your country to come to our country if they haven't done ABC, that kind of thing. But this Danish newspaper, and I think is one if not one of the top two of the newspapers in their country, and that is, they quote, "We failed." The Danish newspaper apologizes for publishing official COVID narratives without questioning them.
Yeah.
Isn't this amazing?
Yeah. You'll never see that here, ever.
There was a time, not that many years ago, it was sloppy, but we did have a lot more good journalists out there questioning it. And now, since I was a newspaper boy, I knew something about newspapers, and it was that the news was different than the editorial page.
Yeah.
Somebody told me that. They said, "Oh, I thought newspapers were supposed to be neutral," and they said, "Oh no, but if on the editorial page it's different." And I understood that and thought, well, that sounds logical. So I sort of read news differently than I read editorials. But that has totally failed. And this is an apology that they sent in, and they said they just messed up, and they didn't follow, and they had strong advice. He says, the mental alertness has worn out tremendously on all of us. That is why we, the press, must also take stock of our own effort. That's pretty good advice, We have not been vigilant enough at the Garden Gate. He goes on and on. It's a great lecture. I wonder, it'd be interesting to see how the people are reacting to this.
Yeah. I mean, it is something you literally would never, ever see in the Washington Post, the New York Times. All of these publications that lie after lie after lie. And it's not only that they lied, they basically acted as stenographers for government press releases. They never said, hey, this doesn't make sense. Can you explain it? No, they just printed it. And here's a very dramatic, and this is a translation, this is a very, very dramatic headline from the newspaper, if we can put up this next clip. Very dramatic. We failed. That's it. Just 2 letters. And here's a tweet about the article, if we can do that next one, because it does have a slide explanation, if we can put up that next clip. One of the largest newspapers in Denmark is apologizing for its journalistic failure during COVID-19 by only publishing official government messages without questioning them. You got to give them credit. Nobody likes to say, I'm sorry, I messed up. Only Walter Jones in politics has ever done that.
Yeah.
You don't get any brownie points for saying I was duped or I messed up or whatever.
Yes, it's amazing. So truth is breaking out, and hope Denmark gets some benefits from this, and I hope people get excited about it. But I don't think it will be, the story is going to be, I don't think we clipped this story from the Washington Post.
Yeah, no.
or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah,
They're not going to do that.
Well, I'm going to close if we're
Okay.
ready. And I just want to thank our viewers. We did a new Ron Paul Institute update last night that I put out, and you can get that update for free. Go to ronpaulinstitute.org and subscribe. I'll send out another one tonight to those who subscribe today, talking about some of the things we talked about today. But the other thing I want to say is, if you've been watching the show for the past couple of weeks, I may have looked a little green around the gills. And that wasn't because I've been drinking poison or rot gut or something, but we had a camera go out and we had to use a backup camera. And thankfully, some good friends, some good viewers of the Ron Paul Liberty Report, they happened to have gone to your house to our supporter summit. But I want to thank Randy Laskowitz and Dan Johnson for coming forward and literally buying us a new camera that we can be back how we were. We can continue to improve the studio. We do have plans to improve our studio coming this year, and we're going to reach out to you to help us do that. And of course, we are going to do all sorts of things to thank you, including talk about your name on the show and et cetera. So keep your eye on this space as we continue to improve. Our viewership is growing. We're just a hair away from 300,000 subscribers here. And we're growing on other platforms as well. But thanks to Randy and Dan for your wonderful generosity in getting us this new camera. And we look forward to seeing you and all of you at a future Ron Paul Institute event. Dr. Paul?
Very good. I want to just reiterate what we were talking about earlier, and that is this new unit the Department of Justice has set up to combat domestic terrorism, trying to be more precise on the definition of terrorism and trying to expose the fact that the federal government shouldn't even be involved in local policing. A national police force is not what the founders had in mind, and yet it's casually accepted by so many people now that we should have a national police force to do all these wonderful things and keep us safe and free. And we have grown to accept this principle that the purpose of government is to make us safe. And I think it sounds good, it sounds wonderful, and I'm concerned about safety, and I think everybody should be, but I think the responsibility really is ultimately the individual, the family, the local community, and groups doing it, or local government authority, but not the federal government. But even for any government that is taking this assumption that my job is to make sure that you're safe. I've made this statement once, which is very true. They can't do that. If you had a policeman on every corner in the house, on the street, you probably still couldn't do it. They can't even, protect people against drugs in prisons. It just happens that things get around. So this whole idea, the purpose of government, setting up a new unit to police us, it's not going to work. It's probably going to diminish, our liberties and not enhance our safety and our freedoms. And so often, probably almost always, the legislation passed is always done with wonderful, wonderful promises. We're going to make you healthy, we're going to make you rich, we're going to give you food, we're going to have peace in the world, and we're going to make sure there are no terrorists around. At the same time, they will use tactics which are equivalent to what terrorists do, intimidation. And we saw and witnessed a little bit of that on this war against COVID. So this is the kind of thing that we should think about, because ultimately our concern should be providing for a free society. Because my goal in life has been to try to make it conditions where people can work for their own excellence and virtue, which is something very, very personal. It happens to do with personal moral beliefs. But it can't be done by government. So when government takes over this role of making us safe and secure and taking care of us, believe me, they're destroying the very thing they're trying to save and secure. That's why the principles of liberty need to be understood, and the people willing to defend those principles. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.